Jewish people, no offense, suck at communicating to the rest of the world. And Palestinians, because of what they've learned through Arafat and the Soviet Union, are so good at communicating with the Western world.
Everybody split their land.
Yeah, but everybody fought over splitting their land. I agree, I understand they're not special. Yeah, everybody splits it, but everybody fights over it too.
Exactly.
Let me be super clear. The Arabs have always rejected, to the enjoyment of Israel, have always rejected the existence of an independent Israeli state. The full stop, period. There's a reason why Finkelstein or Mouin Rabbani wouldn't answer that question when I asked, like, oh, well, how do you in 52, I think, what kind of like deal, what kind of two-state solution do you think would look fair to the Palestinian side?
So those are two different questions. To your first question.
All right. So Einat Wilf and Stephen Bonnell, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
There's a lot going on in the Middle East, and I want to understand your perspectives on it. And is Israel doing the right thing? Are there mistakes being made? How do we move forward to get this conflict ultimately resolved? Einat, what do you think?
So in terms of how the conflict gets resolved in the end, I think we need to understand that this is not going to be anything small. The conflict will have to be resolved on three elements. The first, probably the big conflict with Iran does not end until the Ayatollah regime is gone. For the simple reason that as long as the ideology of the Ayatollahs is death to Israel, it's not exactly a negotiable position with which we can live. So in terms of the conflict, it could ebb, it could flow, but ultimately it could only end if the Ayatollah regime and the ideology end. And of course, I could say a lot of Israelis are very much looking forward to being good friends with the Iranians once more. In terms of Lebanon, Israel has no territorial dispute with Lebanon. Israel would be thrilled if Lebanon acted like a sovereign country, took control of its territory. And then I believe that the way the conflict ends is with peace. Actual, proper peace agreement. Not useless ceasefires, not worse than useless peacekeeping forces, not UN resolutions that nobody bothers to enforce until Israel actually starts to enforce it, and then everyone screeches ceasefire. This has to end with Lebanon assuming full sovereignty over its territory and making peace with Israel. And finally, in Gaza, the conflict ends when the ideology that has given birth to the conflict comes to an end. And it's an ideology that I've come to call Palestinianism, essentially the ideology that negates Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land. So Gaza is ultimately just the most recent bloody arena in the century-long conflict. And therefore, that war and that conflict only ends when the foundations of the conflict end, which is the complete and total rejection of Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land. So again, an ideology dies and hopefully peace is born.
Do you agree, Stephen?
Let's see. So for point one, something definitely has to change with Iran. I would be a little hesitant to say that the only way that a peaceful agreement can be made or some sort of lasting peace can happen is with the downfall of the Ayatollah. I know they don't enjoy a great deal of support among the population right now, but I think that kind of orienting yourself towards the collapse of another nation's regime is a little scary. It puts us in an awkward place. And by that, I mean, it just seems to, I guess, call for future conflict. Insofar as Lebanon goes, I'm not the most preeminent expert on Lebanon, but I don't think that the Lebanese government possesses the military capability of expelling Hezbollah from their country completely. I don't think that their lack of sovereignty right now is a choice. It's probably more that Hezbollah and their workings with Assad and their workings with the Ayatollah are what allow them to remain so entrenched in power there. And then the defeat of the ideology of Palestinianism, I guess insofar as Palestinians that deny Israel a right to exist, that ideology needs to be gone. But I mean, so too does the Zionist ideology that Palestinians can't exist in any like measured form in any kind of like mutually understood peace agreement where instead we've just seen kind of like more and more expansion into the West Bank, more and more military conflict with no end in sight to the occupation, the disputed territory, the lack of some kind of like finalized agreement or settlement between the two parties.
So, Stephen, you're saying that Zionist ideology, to the extent that Zionist ideology means a rejection of Palestinian statehood, must also go away. Einat, what do you think of that?
That was never part of the Zionist ideology. Zionism is quite simply the political movement for the liberation and self-determination of the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland. From the beginning, Zionist thinkers have made it clear that they want to live next to Arabs, not instead of them. It was never an ideology of negation or rejection, which is why when you go back a century, going back to the original two-state solution, the one that created Transjordan, the Zionist leaders have always agreed to every two-state solution as long as one of the two is the Jewish state. And the Arabs, the Palestinians, have always rejected every two-state solution if one of the two is the Jewish state. So I agree that there are Israelis that have another vision, but ultimately you judge nations like you judge people on the decisions that they make when they actually face a choice. People can say that they want A and B and C, but you really know who they are when they face a choice between A and B. And whenever Israel faced a clear and concrete choice for peace, for two states, it has always been willing to give up territory, to divide the land. And it's important for me to emphasize that this has nothing to do with being nice or being moral. I don't believe such things exist in international relations. It simply has to do with the fact of our numerical minuteness. The Jewish people, given the hugely successful Muslim and Arab conquests of the Levant and North Africa in the 7th century, it means that as long as the Jews are Zionists, as long as the Jews care about being a sovereign people in their ancestral homeland, in any part of it, they are destined or damned, choose your word, to remain an ethnic, linguistic, religious, and national minority in an Arab and Islamic Middle East, which is why we always agree to compromises. Again, not because we're nice, not because it would be what we would do if we were 1 billion Jews, but as long as we're 7 million Jews, surrounded by 500 million Arabs and nearly 2 billion Muslim, who, despite very positive developments in some places of the Arab world, remain by and large committed to what Abba Eban called policide, the non-existence of the Jews as a sovereign people, then we will always say yes. So Palestinianism, as the ideology of rejecting the Jewish state, has always been at the core of the conflict, and that ideology has to die. We will always say yes to any peace with people who want to live next to us rather than instead of us.
What about what Israelis are doing in the West Bank, Stephen?
Well, I don't disagree with anything that was said. You obviously, if you're looking for a mutual solution, you can't call Palestinianism and then like an ideology of rejectionism, then label it as you want, and then say, well, this is what Zionism is. I'm sure you're more familiar than I am with how many people so desperately want to relabel Zionism as meaning, ideology committed to ethnic superiority, or committed to ethnic cleansing and genocide, or committed to the expulsion of all Arabs from the Levant, or committed to the infinite expansion of Israel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. People will define Zionism however they want in order to hate Israel, hate Jews, whatever, which is obviously not productive. I would just say that calling an ideology like, well, we need to be anti-Palestinian or we need to reject Palestinianism, I just think is not productive. I do agree that you have to reject this idea of people that reject any kind of nation of Israel, or more specifically, a country that is interested in protecting the ethnic Jewish people, as broad as that's become. I agree that type of ideology needs to be rejected, but I just saying that we need to have a rejection of Palestinian ideology, I think is a pretty harsh and unproductive term. And I think that people on the Palestinian side are going to hear that as a dog whistle for, oh, you just want to subjugate us or kick us out completely, the same way that people on that side hear, Zionism as, that's just a conquesting, expansionist term for you guys trying to kick all of us out or whatever. I reject, I guess, the terminology there, but I don't think I reject any of the underlying ideas, unless the terminology is being used to sneak in other underlying ideas.
It might be just a semantic thing. I mean, we both agree that Palestinians who want peace for both peoples, like we believe in their right to have a state, and we both agree that Israelis who use the term Zionism as meaning just wanting a home for the Jewish state, we support that as well. And we just disagree with anyone who stands on either side and rejects peace with the other people. So I think part of this is just a semantic thing.
I mean, I don't like dismissing things as semantics. Language is important. It's arguably the thing that makes us human, right? Language is one of the most important things that we have, and a lot of people use semantics. Again, I mean, if you're familiar with Jewish dog whistling, right? Like they, them, or whatever, like people use semantics to sneak in a lot of garbage. So I would be uncomfortable, I guess, siding with anybody that says we need to reject Palestinian ideology, because it's like, well, hold on, what does that mean? Because in one crowd, you might say like, well, that just means that we need to reject the people who don't accept that an Israeli state can exist that is interested in the protection of Jewish people. And that's, yeah, I think that would be the message that I think people would hear when you say that. Yeah.
What are you thinking, Einat?
So I agree the language is important, but it's actually, this is something that is more empirical. It's not about kind of, I know people love the story of extremists on both sides, but it actually has no legs to stand on. If people want to look, I have my longer talk, which I kind of go through the history of, and my personal history of also believing that the only thing that stood between us and peace are things that have to do with territory. So ending the occupation, Palestinian statehood, no settlements, only to discover again and again that what stands between us and peace is the Palestinian ideology that rejects wholly and totally the existence of a sovereign Jewish state anywhere in any part of the land between the river and the sea. And I always, as I go through that, I'm sure you know, and we talked about it, I think, last time as well, I bring this quote by Ernst Bevin, the British foreign minister after World War II, and this will also begin to address the West Bank question. He goes to the British Parliament in February 1947 to explain why Britain failed out to fulfill the mandate to help the Jews achieve a state. It didn't fail the Arabs, there's Jordan, there's Iraq, but it fails the Jews. And he needs to explain why. And he says His Majesty's is thus faced with an irreconcilable conflict. Now, he calls it irreconcilable in February 1947. In February 1947, there's no occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. The West Bank is not yet called the West Bank because Jordan has not yet created and annexed it. There are no settlements. There's no occupation. There's no blockade of Gaza. There's no Gaza Strip as such. There are no Arab refugees because they haven't yet waged war. There's no state of Israel. So all the things that we bring today as the reasons, the causes for the Palestinian anger, grievances, violence don't exist yet, which is why this is so valuable. Because already in February 1947, he says His Majesty's government is thus faced with an irreconcilable conflict. He calls it irreconcilable when nothing exists in terms of West Bank or settlements or all that. And yet, and then he goes on to say, the reason that the conflict is irreconcilable between the Jews and Arabs in the land, he says, is because for the Jews, the top priority is to establish a sovereign Jewish state. So that's Zionism. That's actually a clear definition. The political movements for self-determination, the Jews want statehood, sovereignty for the Jewish people and nation in their ancestral homeland. Doesn't have to be all of it, can be part of it. This is why the Jews say yes to multiple partition proposals. And then he goes on to say, and the Arabs, and they're not yet called Palestinians, but they will be one day. And he goes on to say, and the Arabs in the land, their top priority, remember, is to resist to the last the establishment of Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land. So already in February 1947, he understands that what unites the Arabs of the land, the Palestinians later to be called, is the rejection of Jewish sovereignty as a top priority. I have come to call that Palestinianism. You can call it anti-Zionism, Arab anti-Zionism, rejection of Jewish sovereignty. But unfortunately, in the last century, there are no exceptions to that ideology. There have not been any there have been no leaders, but not even any notable voices among the Palestine Arabs who have put forth a vision of wanting to live next to a Jewish state rather than prioritizing the non-existence of a Jewish state. So in that sense, I think I'm on very solid ground when I'm saying that this ideology, however you call it, of rejecting a Jewish state anywhere between the river and the sea is what unites and connects the Palestinians.
What in 47? Why did the Arabs, or why was it said that there were irreconcilable differences? Where did that stem from?
Because by definition, if the Jews want a state and the Arabs want the Jews not to have a state, that's irreconcilable. You cannot negotiate that. He's not saying the Jews want a state, the Arabs want a state, and we just need some help dividing the land equitably. He says, as a matter of top priority, the Jews want a state, and the Arabs want the Jews not to have a state. Now,
but where did the feelings come from? Why do they not want the Jews to have a state there?
Okay, so that's really a question that a lot of people, once they internalize that this is at the core of the conflict, then a lot of people ask exactly this question. Then why? Why for a century divert all your significant capabilities as a people to the destruction of the Jewish state? And here, there are a couple explanations. I think some changing demographics have to do with it, but I think it's a very small reason. I can explain later why. I think the biggest reason has to do with the sociology and theology of the Arab world at that moment. I'm saying at that moment because I still believe in the possibility of change. At that moment, in the late 19th, early 20th century, the Arab world has spent about 1,200, 1,300 years when it has known only one kind of Jew. A Jew who is dispossessed, stateless, essentially in exile. Kingdom is long lost, 6, 7 centuries earlier, meek, weak. So as the Arabs kind of sweep across the Levant and North Africa and conquer them and make them Arab and Muslim, they give the Jew a certain role in that society. The Jews are not pagans, so they cannot be Islamized by the sword, but they're not Muslims, right? I sometimes joke that from the Muslim perspective, the Jews are the people that got the first book right, but not the sequels. So the Jews are accorded a status called dhimmi, which places them as lower in the hierarchy and status of Arab and Muslim societies. And there are many, many factors that single out the dhimmi status. Yellow, for example, doesn't come from Europe or Nazi Germany. It comes from the Muslim world. But my two favorite examples of the dhimmi status is that the Jews could not ride horses in the Arab world. Horses were a mark of dignity. They were actually also a weapon of war. So Jews could only ride donkeys. And Jews, of course, could not carry arms because the very definition of dhimmi was that the defense of the Jew was the prerogative of the Arab and Muslim ruler. Sometimes more, sometimes less, but the prerogative of the Arab and Muslim ruler. Now, if you look at the early images of Zionism from the early 20th century, the first things that immediately jump at you is that those Jews ride horses and carry arms. Imagine the sociological, theological, cultural shock of having people whom for 1,200, 1,300 years you were used to looking down upon, that as far as you were concerned, it was a law of nature that those people were below you, they were defenseless, they had certain markers, and those people are rising in the name of this ideology of Zionism to say, we are your equals, we will defend ourselves by ourselves. I write a lot about comparing feminism and Zionism as movements of liberation, and the almost instinctive and violent response to Jews challenging their inferior role in society is a violent response that demands that the Jews, so to speak, go back to their proper place as meek, weak, and powerless.
Okay, that was a lot. I feel like we're missing a really big part of the puzzle here, though, which is before the Ottoman Empire collapsed in the late 1800s, I think starting around the 1880s, and then going to the very, very early 1900s, you had these kind of failed waves of early migration from Jewish people, a lot from the Eastern Russian Empire, some from Europe that tried to go to the Levant, but ultimately failed for a variety of reasons. Then in the early 1900s, especially after 1917, when the Ottoman Empire collapsed, when Britain gets this mandate for Palestine, and then when the Jewish people, the Zionists of Europe, secure the Balfour Declaration, right, which was a promise from the United Kingdom to establish some kind of home for the Jewish people in, I guess, what we call today Israel/Palestine, in the mandatory Palestine area, you had out of nowhere a whole bunch of Jewish people that were now starting to immigrate, backed by Zionist money from other people around the world that came in, that were buying land from Arabs there, and we're slowly starting to build villages, we're slowly starting to build cities, and we're starting to grow in significant number. I think that there was probably a fear, I think a reasonable one, that you had this Ottoman Empire that collapsed. You had a bunch of now kind of like scattered Arabs in all of these different states that had once seen themselves as potentially being part of this kind of like pan-Arab nation, right? Ideas that would later be pursued militarily by people like Nasser, by people like Saddam Hussein. And now, because you have all of these, what they perceived as European Jews that were coming into the Levant, they were, I think, reasonably worried that, like, oh shoot, we're not going to have a country the same way that people up in Iraq were getting a country, or people over in Syria, or the monarchy over in Jordan, or the people in Egypt are getting states. Now we're having to split it with all of these European Jews coming in. There were several white papers that the United Kingdom commissioned to figure out, well, what's the progress going on in the mandatory Palestine area, which was the name for the mandate that the UK or Britain had for that territory, where the idea was they were going to rule it for some period of time, then hand it over to whatever state kind of emerged as a stable state from there. And I think that the people living there, the Arab people / Palestinians, that identity was just kind of starting to form in like the 20s and 30s with the Mufti in Jerusalem, kind of, but not really strongly until, as a response, especially to the Jewish people that were migrating in. I think the Arabs reasonably were worried about all the Jews coming in, and that's why in 47, when the Peel Commission happened, right, that paper that you're referring to, where they say, well, now we think partition is impossible, it was because of the growing tensions between the Jewish people and the Arab people there. A lot of the violence, I think, prior to 47, instigated by the Arabs, especially prior to 1940, instigated by the Arabs, but a lot of fear that a lot of Jewish people were coming in that had been basically guaranteed the ability to travel in from the Brits. Not to say that any of this justifies violence today, or that this necessarily changes anything you said, but I think it adds a little dimension to why people were afraid. It's not that Arabs or what would become the Palestinians just started off as like, God, we hate Zionists and Jews, and blah, although Muslims kind of did. But it didn't start off that way. It started off, I think, more with kind of like, well, here's all of these people that are coming into this territory, and now we feel like we're going to lose what could be our potential state in the way that the other Arab forming states around us are getting one.
Okay, so I'll address it in a few ways. If that were the case, then that would have been the case for everybody, because every single Arab state was not happy with what they got. I once saw this little cute app or video that showed every country in the world, and especially in Europe, but every country in the world at its zenith. So every country, how much territory it had in its kind of the historical height. And the amazing thing is that every country in the world today has a history where it views itself, or was it, as much, much larger. Even little Luxembourg was once, I don't know, about a third of Europe. So if the claim is that the Arab total rejection of a Jewish state in any borders, right? It's not a fight over the size of the Jewish state. It's about no Jewish sovereignty. And the phrasing is Jewish sovereignty. So it's about the Jews being sovereign. This is why I think it's more about the status of the Jews rather than, more specific things. Then every country in the world would be in eternal war because it believes it should have gotten more. The Iraqis thought they should have gotten more, the Jordanians, the Syrians, the Lebanese, it doesn't matter. So this in itself does not make sense, because that cannot be the reason. The other thing about the changing demographics, one of my favorite things, first of all, there was a Jewish immigration before. As people know, in the 19th century, Jerusalem is a Jewish majority state, but really the rise in the Arab population of the Mandate area, amazingly, in the years 1930, 31, 32, the rise in the Arab population of the Mandate is the highest rise of a population anywhere in the world. And a lot of people for many years thought that this had to do with immigration, with Arab immigration into the Mandate area, spurred on by what you described, the fact, the prosperity, the investment that came with Zionism and the ideology of creating a Jewish state. But what's amazing, and hopefully this can be shown, or maybe you can then put a link, but if you can see a bit, you can see two maps here. The two-toned map is the partition map, And the blue and light blue is the incidence of malaria in the early 20th century. So what you see, it's almost 1-to-1. I have also another map that shows that this is also the map of land ownership. So basically, the Jews purchase malaria-infested land, mostly from absentee landlords, and they eradicate malaria, bringing science. They're one figure in particular, an ardent Zionist who brought about the eradication of malaria. And actually, the rise in the Arab population in the 30s is in large part due to the eradication of malaria. So the demographic changes actually are as much a part of Zionism actually leading to the rise in Arab demography. There are more Arabs. So again, to claim that there was a fear, that makes no sense. And ultimately, even if there was a fear that they will not get a state, then you can't explain why, once they are given two opportunities in 1937 with the Peel Commission to have an Arab state on 70% of the land, and the Jews were only given 17%, the rest was going to be international. And in 1947, when they are offered this map where the Jews are essentially going to be given the lands in which they eradicated malaria plus desert, and on both occasions, the Arabs, in their words, just in their words, we don't have to put ideas into them, say very clearly that it's more important for them that the Jews not have a state. And by the way, they say that. They say that the Jews are not a people worthy of a state. They say that the Jews, this is not their appropriate status. They talk about the existence of Jewish sovereignty as a source of shame. But if they were merely concerned about having a state, they actually had clear and distinct opportunities to have a state. But not only have they rejected those opportunities every time, they went to brutal war between 36 and 39 and between 47 and 49. In both cases, in 36 to 39, unfortunately, they had a big political win in which they managed to prevent the establishment of a Jewish state on the eve of the Holocaust, which is why, in parentheses, I think they bear also great responsibility, at least for the fact that hundreds of thousands of Jews, if not more, did not have the state that they were supposed to have in the 30s. But ultimately, if their concern was about having a state, they should have done what the Jordanians and Iraqis and Syrians and Lebanese and the Luxembourgians did, which is accept a state, which is not everything, but is something. But the fact remains that it was always more important for them, in their words, that the Jews not have a state than to have a state for themselves of any size.
Yeah, I mean, the Jordanians, the Iraqis, the Syrians, the Lebanese, the Egyptians, none of these people were asked to split their territory with what they saw as European transplants. Again, I don't deny that they rejected the existence of...
Anna, what'd you say?
What?
Oh, again, this is an imposition of a later view. They did not view them as a European transplant. They understood very well that they are Jews. They knew what Jews are.
Sure, but they absolutely viewed them as European transplants. Right.
No, they viewed them as Jews who dared challenge the appropriate order of being at the bottom.
Do you think that if it would have been British people or if it would have been any other group of people, you think they would have been okay with them moving there?
I think it would have been a much less emotional and a much shorter conflict. Yes.
But Stephen, I don't want to get away from your first point. Your first point was that these other countries didn't have to split their territory with other people. So they were viewed as like Europeans. This idea that it was just because they were Jews is nonsense. There were a whole bunch of people that were being moved into their region of the world after they had lost to Britain, and they viewed it as basically, oh, you're bringing in a whole bunch of Europeans now. They were Jews, and Arabs and Jews do have a special relationship, of course, but I don't think that made it significantly worse. I think it could have been Christians. It could have been other types of people. It could have been Russians. It could have been Brits. It could have been Americans. It could have been anybody. They would have viewed it as an imposition on their land, that everybody around them, all those other countries you mentioned, all had their own territory. And as much as you might say, nobody was happy with what they were given, I don't believe there's been any border changes or territorial changes whatsoever since the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Einat, you're trying to create an analogy to say the other countries didn't have the same reaction as the Palestinians, but I think what Stephen's saying is the other countries didn't have to split their territory. How do you think of that?
Of course, everyone had to split their territory. That is the very essence of the breakdown of empires. Singling out the Palestine Arabs as somehow uniquely wronged is part of the revision of history.
Wait, who else had other people that came in en masse after 1917? Who else had a whole bunch of foreign people coming into their territory to live there?
That's not a whole bunch. A lot of the Arabs moved in as well throughout the 19th and the 20th century. There are population movements all around.
But nothing. But within the Ottoman Empire, but not from Europe.
But again, this is, I believe, your imposition. The view is not that this is some kind of from Europe. The problem is that they are Jews. The problem is that in the Arab and Islamic understanding of what the Jews are supposed to be, the Jews of early Zionism are challenging the role of the Jews. If it had been any other people, I agree, you might have had conflict, as you had in many places, but it wouldn't have been so emotional, so total, so completely rejectionist, and ultimately people would have achieved some kind of resolution. But here, the desire for policide, the desire to erase Jewish sovereignty in any part of the land, the view that Jewish sovereignty is shameful, that's the language they use, shameful to the Arab sense of who they are. If you ignore the fact that they are Jews, you really, I think, don't go to the core of what drives this conflict.
Okay. I mean, this is, I've talked about this in the past with Jake and maybe even you, but I think that the revisionist history on both sides is part of the centerpiece of like the intractability of this conflict, that both sides are so invested in making the other side just seem purely evil or either anti-Arab or anti-Semitic to the core, when I think that a fair reading of history gives you a much more clear picture of what's happening, that you have a defeated people, the Arabs, the Turks, right? You've got the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. Then you have mandates given to Britain, France to run territories. And then in one area, you have tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands of Europeans that come in, and you feel like, oh, wow, we are getting completely and totally shafted. Was there a little bit more hatred because they were Jewish, because Jewish people historically had, a certain view around the world, really, not even just in the Arab societies, but around the world, Jews were viewed as weak, as leeches on society, as bad people or whatever, right? So I'm sure that hurt a little bit more, right? And Arabs saw themselves as proud, as warriors, and now they were being, they felt like they were being subjugated by these weak Jews, people that lived as dhimmi status in their societies. I don't disagree that might have fed into it a little bit, but that's like 5% of it. Like 95%, the idea that if it was just a huge group of like white Orthodox, Russians or a bunch of people from, Italy that had come in and they could have set up shop there, and the Palestinian people or the Arabs or whatever in the Levant would have been like, oh, okay, well, you guys can make a state here. That's cool. It would have been more or less the same conflict as it is today, I think.
So not only do I disagree, I would put 5-10% on the demographics and 90% on the fact that they were Jews. But let's go to Turkey. Indeed, as part of the collapse of empires all around the world and their replacement by nation states when they're lucky, just odd states when they're unlucky. Look, as I'm sure you know, as part of the carving up of the Ottoman Empire, there was supposed to be a Turkish state, a Kurdish state, and an Armenian state. And the Turks essentially rip up this idea. They do what they do to the Kurds. They do what they do to the Armenians. Turkey emerges as twice the size of what it was supposed to be. Kurdistan never emerges. Armenia ultimately emerges as another territory, which is not historical Armenia. This is what the Arabs tried to do to the Jews. They just were not as successful as the Turks. And you don't see that same kind of like global issue. If you take out the role that the Jew plays, both in the Western and Eastern Christian theology and in the Islamic understanding of the hierarchy of their society, and just try to place it as some kind of European, then nothing gets understood. I would also add something else. I hope the Arabs are not people of slow understanding. So even if you were right, and initially they thought these are Europeans, even though, again, they knew very well, read the text in real time, they knew very well those were Jews. But even if they thought that those were some odd Europeans, you would think that given their experience in the last century, let's say they assume that we're like the British and the French, and they still sometimes make those comparisons and therefore just push them out through violence and they will ultimately go away. You would think that by now they would be clued in to the fact that the problem is that these are not Europeans, that these are Jews who have a historical and deep cultural and continuous connection to the land, something, by the way, which Arabs and Muslims knew until a campaign of erasure started for the last century. So you would think that by now they would figure it out. So, and yet...
Why would that make them comfortable splitting their land, though, with any people?
Because at one point, again, why are they special? Everybody split their land.
Yeah, but everybody fought over splitting their land. I agree. I understand they're not special. Yeah, everybody splits it, but everybody fights over it too.
Exactly. But at one point, people figure it out, they end it, and they choose a path in which, yeah, they don't get everything they want, but they get enough to have a state. But we, for some reason, still are stuck at a point where the vision is from the river to the sea. And I am arguing that if you take from the equation the fact that this is about Jews, you cannot account for why it continues so long with such ferocity and with no alternative voices, with complete dedication.
Steven?
I mean, I've stated my point. She stated hers. I mean, we can go back and forth on this forever, but I also don't think that I would say, sometimes I wish, I say this sometimes, I wish that people would just like basically completely neglect the history, because I feel like the history is just weaponized on both sides to give both sides claims to never have to settle for peace for the other side. The idea basically that, well, the other side, the Israelis are foreign invaders that have just taken over this land, and they're genociders and apartheiders, so why should we ever make deals with them? And then on the Jewish side, it's like, well, you guys were conquestors who always rejected us being here. Oh, you're powered only by anti-Semitism. You just hate us because we're Jews, so why should we negotiate with you? I don't think that either side gets any closer to like an answer today in terms of how you solve the problem. But then when I hear people bring out these historical arguments, I'm not even sure if they would accept the solution to the problem. Like would you accept, for instance, like a two-state solution that involves land swap so that the West Bank is, I guess, up to 95 to 100% of the prior territory that would have been given to the Palestinians in 67? Or what kind of like deal, what kind of two-state solution do you think would look fair to the Palestinian side?
So those are two different questions. To your first question, of course, the reason that I do what I do is precisely because through a slow and painful process, I have come to understand that what stands between us and peace is not which way we will partition the land, because from the Arab-Palestinian perspective, the top priority is no Jewish state. And when you're saying history is weaponized, first of all, as a parenthesis, one of the things that I find most difficult often with people these days is a complete ahistorical attitude. People say, just do things now. This is the solution. Don't mind history. But there's no such thing. People individually and collectively are their histories.
Sorry, I don't want to interrupt, but I do want to jump in.
Let me just finish the two thoughts. And again, you created a sentence that wasn't true, because the Jews think that for the Arabs, their vision of the Jew plays a role in their ideology. They're not willing to compromise. But again, empirically, it's not true. The Jews have said yes to any two-state solution as long as one of the two is the Jewish state. And the Arabs have always said no to any two-state solution as long as one of the two is the Jewish state. Now, I'm not making a judgment in this call. You seem to think that I am, but I'm not. This is a description. And this is a description that I have yet to see any Arab person, as opposed to any Westerner, contradict. They will say apartheid, but they will actually confirm that their opposition is to a Jewish state in any borders. Whereas here I am online, listen to me, I am confirming yet again that I am always happy to divide the land with the Arabs living in the land, to live in two states. But for that to happen, they need to actually want a state. The problem is that they've never wanted a state, not if the Jews also have a state. And the problem is that we often focus on the borders and settlement and all that. But if you, the litmus test, and this is why I focus on it in my work and books, is this so-called idea of a right of return, which again is not a right, and the perpetual refugeehood, which is why in order to know if you found a Palestinian who really wants peace, the question is, do you recognize the equal right, equal, not superior, not exclusive, again, the equal right of the Jewish people to self-determination in their historic homeland? And I will say, preempt that, I recognize the right of the Palestine Arabs to self-determination in the land. Yes, I do. The equal right to self-determination. I recognize their right to self-determination. But then they need to eye it, and they understand their vision is to live in an Arab state next to a Jewish state and not from the river to the sea. And again, I'll preempt. I support living in a Jewish state next to an Arab state, not from the river to the sea. And then they need to understand, that the implication is that they are not multiple generational refugees living in the West Bank and Gaza, and that they possess no such thing as a right of return into the sovereign state of Israel. And I will again say, and I recognize that this means that the establishment of a Palestinian Arab state means that we have no rights to settle in that state, and if it doesn't want to give us those rights. That's a truly mutual recognition of peace. And I can assure you that in 20 years of actively searching for Palestine Arabs who will publicly and in their own voice sign on to that declaration, I have found 3 courageous individuals.
So,
I mean, like, I guess historical disagreements aside, I mean, I do agree with that. There's the elephant in the room that nobody seems to honestly want to engage with, is that it feels like there hasn't been Palestinian leadership that has ever truly accepted the existence of a Jewish state. There's kind of like lip service paid to it, but hanging in the back of all these negotiations is always this idea of this kind of unlimited Palestinian right of return, where the number of refugees has been driven up so high. I don't know if it's 6-7 million now, that there's always like an agreement for, okay, well, we'll accept this, that's fine. But also 7 million Palestinians need to have a right of return. And they're kind of sneaky with how they say this, because they'll say right of return to Palestinian lands, but Palestinian lands actually means the entire mandatory Palestine area, which means millions of Palestinians returning into Israel proper. And regardless of what anybody says, and you can go over all the talks and the different perspectives with Arafat, you can go over 2008, Olmert and Abu Mazen, you can go over any of these talks. There has never, ever, not in the Arab peace resolutions on anything, there's never been a concrete number given of this is how many refugees we want to accept back, to go back to Israel. That's always left open. I think that after the Taba summit, I don't remember if it was the Palestinian negotiators or maybe it was, oh God, I forget the names. Is it Arab Psycat? That's not his name. In 2008, the negotiator that worked with Abbas, I think they said verbatim, like, why would we ever give up the right of a single Palestinian to return to the Israeli homeland like that? We would never, ever compromise on that. And until there's like a reasonable settlement on that, obviously the solution is out of grasp for both parties. My issue is just that I feel like both parties are fully incentivized to continue the conflict. Israel can always continue to expand into the West Bank and shore up their territorial, I'll say conquest, even though that's a trigger word. It's just kind of, solidifying their control over Area C. And for the Palestinians, they've never had to suffer a real political defeat since 47, I don't know, 67 maybe, because they always have in their mind, well, no matter what we do, no matter what happens, we can always go back to the pre-67 borders, no matter what. And as long as both sides feel like they don't really have anything to lose by continue to fight, it would be irrational for either side to pursue a peace agreement. Like if you were a Palestinian and you said yes to a two-state solution, you would be an idiot, because the ICC and the ICJ and the rest of the international community is eventually coming to save you. So why agree for anything now? And if you're Israeli, why would you agree to any kind of ceasefire or any kind of temporary or even long-term thing when, Iran and the rest of the world can still ship in, weapons to the Gaza Strip or attack you or do whatever else, basically with impunity? Why would you agree to anything? And then you'd give up your right to kind of like settle into what I would say delusional Jews view as the historic, Judea and Samaria, and their right to settle that homeland of the West Bank. So yeah, I think it's a big clusterfuck, but it's a bad, yeah.
What do you think about the West Bank Area C stuff, Einat? Stephen saying that he holds Israelis accountable for their expansion and settlements in the West Bank. Do you agree or disagree with that being a problem?
First I have to say, Stephen, we could have skipped over all what we spent so far, because once you said what you said, especially on the continued insistence on this idea of return, then that's basically my argument that there has never been any moment when there was an agreement for a two-state solution when one of the Jewish. And you're saying that the Jews don't have an incentive? That's so not true. Living like this is terrible. We would have wanted, with all due respect, and this is also to your question, Jake, to the West Bank, the vast majority of Israeli Jews could absolutely care less about it. And I even have recent empirical proof, because you remember when people talk about annexing some areas of the West Bank after the Trump peace plan, and everyone talked about annexation. And I remember I participated in a lot of panels. Then I said, look, Israelis don't care about it. And then the Emirati ambassador to the US wrote a big op-ed, and he said, guys, how about you shelf this annexation idea and you get direct flights to Dubai? And Israelis were like, yes. So the preferred and revealed preferences of Israelis for a century have been always peace over territory, as long as we have something to live in. But if we can have more peace and less territory, that has always been the revealed preferences of the Israelis. Whatever's happening in the West Bank is the direct outcome. And I'm sorry, but I love when people say, okay, just end the occupation now. And when I say, okay, but we need to understand why there's an occupation and why it doesn't end. There's an occupation because, again, the Arab world continued its wars. And whenever Israel tried to end the occupation, either unilaterally or in agreement, the Palestinians have made it clear that they're not interested in any agreement that establishes a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, and thereby ends Israel's military place there, the occupation, if that means forgoing return, which is another way to say accepting a Jewish state. So we're stuck. But if tomorrow the Arabs of Gaza and the West Bank would rise up to say, we are done with our century-long war against Zionism. We have realized it's been a waste of time. We want to devote our resources to have a state next to the Jewish state. We're done from the river to the sea. We understand that we're now refugees multiple generations, and we possess no right of return into the sovereign state of Israel. We just want to live next to the Jewish state rather than instead of it. I can assure you that the next day there is a peace agreement. And again, not because the Jews are nice, but because we're small and we are paying a massive price for the fact that there is no peace. But we have yet to be shown an alternative which does not demand death to Israel.
I mean, is it pronounced? It's Einat?
Einat, yes.
Einat. Yeah. I'm hesitant to agree with Einat, but yeah, I feel like the most damaging thing that is happening with this conflict is the international community's involvement. Again, if you were a Palestinian trying to make peace today, I think you'd probably be assassinated, because why would you ever make peace when you know that Israel maybe is going to be declared a genocidal state, depending on how this ICJ case goes, that maybe the ICC will swoop in and arrest Gallant or arrest Netanyahu, or maybe the surrounding Arab states will save us, or maybe Iran or the Houthis or Hezbollah or Hamas will come back or something. Like, when you have all of these external forces that are basically saying fight, 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 why would you ever, make peace? And I think, yeah, I feel like that's probably the number one obstacle right now to any kind of peaceful agreement being reached. It's just incredibly destructive, in my opinion.
But you still see the West Bank settlements as fundamentally problematic and not justified, right, Stephen?
The issue with them is that you could do like a whole thing on this. The problem is that what Anna said earlier is right. There's there's like different ways to have a conversation about what's going on in the Middle East. But one of the things that, and I've learned this recently, surprisingly, Jewish people, no offense, suck at communicating to the rest of the world. And Palestinians, because of what they've learned through Arafat and the Soviet Union, are so good at communicating with the Western world. And when you go to the Western world and you talk about peace between Israel and Palestine, you know, it's always like, well, what are the land swap percentages? And what is transportation going to look like? And what are the borders going to look like? And from the history of agreements that I've seen in the negotiations, I mean, like it was said that when Arafat went into negotiations in 2000, he didn't even have in mind like land percentages. When I speak to oh my God, I'm forgetting all the names. So I've been so in American domestic politics. I spoke to Balin and I spoke to Shlomo Ben Ami when they talked about negotiations and they talked about the different things that they were trying to do. They were saying that one of the big issues is that when Arafat would come in for negotiations, in his mind, he's thinking like 60, 70% land. And then all of a sudden the Israelis are like, what about like 80 or 90? He's like, huh, well, hold on. Well, wait. Well, maybe we'll just wait and see what they offer. Because at the end of the day, I don't know if the land stuff actually matters. I think it has more to do with the concept of the state of Israel, because when you finally sit down and accept that Israel exists, what you're really saying is you've lost the 80-year conflict with the Jews, which sucks. And you're also saying we have foregone now all of our refugee right to return, which is a whole other conversation, but that's an issue that, regardless of your side, has been, through policy, dramatically inflated. I think it's Arab Resolution 1537, where they said that there's a reason why you have all of these Palestinian refugees that are living in places like Syria and Lebanon. It's because, and even in Jordan, right, people who were made citizens are still considered refugees. And it's because they're not, a lot of these countries aren't even allowed to give citizenship to Palestinians. They're forbade expressly for doing it so that the number can continue to grow, so that it can always kind of be a thorn in the Israeli side when it comes to negotiations. So until there's like some kind of pressure on Arab leadership. And I mean, the Israeli leadership can be involved in this too, whether it's, as much as both sides seem to hate it, whether it's strengthening the Palestinian Authority, strengthening Mahmoud Abbas and his ability to be a leader or whatever. And I know that people don't like him for a variety of reasons, but there needs to be international pressure and there needs to be internal pressure on the Palestinians. Yeah. I think that this sounds horrible and this is a crazy super Zionist position. And I'm not a pro-Zionist because I'll fight with Einat on her history. I'm probably going to fight later with Gideon on his history or Elon Levy. Or wait, who are we talking to? Oh, Gideon. Okay, Gideon. Yeah, I'll probably fight with him on his history. Like the reality is in my opinion, the reason why the Jewish state was so successful is because it was sink or swim, right? Israel, like the Arabs fought with the understanding or with the idea that, well, we can send them back to Europe, but the Jewish people that went there didn't feel like they had anywhere else to go. So it's either fight or die. And I think that encouraged them to be both pragmatic and ardent in their defense of their country. And for the Palestinians, they don't have that same pressure. They can just fight and fail forever and try and fail forever. And they'll always have, these backup international orgs to back them up. And that needs to disappear. There needs to be an impetus to actually negotiate and say like, hey, if we don't figure this shit out now, we are totally fucked, because that pressure isn't there.
And you still think what they're doing in the West Bank is wrong or no?
I think I don't, saying anything in this region is right or wrong is hard, right? Like the Gaza war, the civilian death is tragic there. But I mean, like, how many hundreds of thousands died in Yemen? What is it? 300 to 500,000 are dead north in Syria. Nobody really cares. So saying, right or wrong is not something I'm as interested in. I'm just saying, like, realistically, the problem that I have with the West Bank, and Sharon saw this, and all the early Israeli leaders saw this. The idea that you can just take over the West Bank with this huge demographic problem and pretend that nothing is like wrong with that, like you're setting yourself up for more and more failure. I think Sharon was very smart to pull out of the Gaza Strip. I know that he wanted to pull out of the West Bank completely. I think he only got like 10 settlements out, but it's just making things more and more intractable is the issue. I think.
Let me jump in really quick. So, Stephen, something you said seems to conflict with an earlier statement. Maybe I'm just misunderstanding. Earlier, the first part of this call, you're disagreeing with Einat about why Arabs rejected Jewish settlement in Israel. Einat was saying it's because they're Jewish, and you were saying no, it's because they're people. They're just coming in. Why would you accept your land? And then you said something more broad, which was that you stand against this categorization of Arabs as always rejecting Jews, and that's not a mindset to get to peace. And yet, on the other hand, now what you're saying is, oh, well, actually, when I think about it, they do always reject Jewish statehood. So which one is it?
Well, hold on. Let me be super clear. The Arabs have always rejected, to the enjoyment of Israel, have always rejected the existence of an independent Israeli state. The full stop, period. There's a reason why Finkelstein or Mouin Rabbani wouldn't answer that question when I asked, like, oh, well, how do you in 52, I think at Lucerne, they would have taken the Gaza Strip and 200,000 Arabs. In 47, they would have accepted a partition plan. In 67, they begged Jordan, hey, please don't attack from the West Bank. You don't want to do that. And they did it anyway. Like, that's always been a thing. So I'm not saying that Arabs have ever accepted some kind of like two-state solution. Einat brought up earlier, the percentages that both sides were going to get. That really doesn't even matter, and in the West, they'll even bring that up. They'll say, well, they were going to give Jews 60% of the land, ignoring the fact that like half of this was the Negev, which is a fucking giant empty desert, right? But the reality is, even if they would have given them 5%, it would have been too much. They don't want any Jewish state there. I'm just saying that the fact that they're Jews, no offense, makes it so much worse, okay? Because historically, keep in mind that Jewish are seen as like a weak, dispossessed, scattered people that, mean and do nothing. And the Arabs see themselves as kind of like proud warriors. You've got 1,000+ years of your caliphates, of your empires, of all this. And to have these like, kind of weak, random people come in and not only establish a state, but then to do so militarily is unthinkable. And there's a whole deal of like generational humiliation that goes into that. Now, again, I don't think that just because they're Jews, I think that was a minority of why the conflict started, but it would be the same as like, if somebody came in and they, beat the shit out of me in my apartment, I would be really, really mad if they beat me up because I would be mad that I got the shit beat out of me. But if it was no offense, but if it was a woman, I would feel that much worse. I'd be like, fuck, I got beat up by a girl too. That's even worse. But the fact that I got beat up was the worst part, but it being a woman makes it even worse, right? Same thing with the fact that the Jews were the ones that came in and did it, I think makes it worse. I think if it would have been anybody, it would have been an issue, but yeah, sorry. It's a complicated issue.
I think Einat's also a feminist in addition to being a Zionist, right? So watch out. Okay.
But I don't beat up anybody.
Yeah.
That's good.
So I understand that Israel imposed the blockade fundamentally for security reasons. That being said, in addition to providing security for Israel, it also inflicts pain on some innocent Palestinians. I think Stephen would agree with this. And I think, Stephen, your position is that as a part of a peace solution, the blockade needs to be removed or reduced, because if you have a situation where a group of people is being oppressed, that's not conducive for lasting peace. Stephen, I'm trying to summarize.
Yeah. Here, I'll give my take, and then Einat can give her take. So I think that the blockade in the Gaza Strip should be removed, because I think the justification argument for it initially was for security purposes, which I think if you look at everything that was being shipped in there from 2000 and onwards, right, from the Second Intifada onwards, I think you can make a strong argument that there's a good reason for the blockade to exist. However, I feel like it's important that Israel sends a message to the world and to the Palestinians that, like, hey, listen, as long as the security concerns are alleviated, like, we're willing to play ball, okay? So we went in, we did a massive, ground operation in Gaza. There was a lot of destruction, but we feel like we got rid of Hamas. So now the blockade goes away. If Hamas comes back, then the blockade goes back. When I think of the blockade, I think of like punishing. I've got a 13-year-old son. They don't have punishments in mind a 13-year-old longer than like 2 weeks. If you try to ground a child for like 4 months, that doesn't mean anything more than 2 weeks. They can only think like 7 days out. So I feel like with the blockade, it can't just be like a forever punishment, because if you're a Palestinian, you're like, okay, well, fuck, this sucks. But like after the war, when the rebuilding and everything happens, the blockade is lifted, as long as everything is like chill, hopefully that like drives people onwards, especially younger people, to be like, okay, well, maybe this like fighting all the time doesn't really get anything done. And now that we can actually ship stuff in here, this is like way better. And hopefully it like alleviates, that kind of like discontent that leads to people like Hamas and everything, rising up. But that's my take on it.
So again, I'd like to empirically challenge the whole notion that the Arabs, the Palestinians, operate as a result of any economic hardship. You all know, of course, that just the massive massacres that were misnamed the Second Intifada happened after a period of growing autonomy, independence, like the notion that the Palestinians will not engage in suicidal actions because they will have something to lose was literally disproved. But I want to read something to you from today. There aren't a lot of critical Palestinian voices from within Gaza, but this is one of them. His name is Ibrahim Ibrash, and he basically says, If we tell the truth, on the eve of October 7th, there was extensive economic activity in Gaza. People who were visited saw that every day there was a new mall, a car exhibition, new towers, new places, new restaurants being opened. He even says that a delegation from Sudan that visited Gaza said that if this is what an Israeli blockade looks like, they hope that Israel will also put a blockade.
We know it cut down their economy by 50%, roughly, based on
what?
We know that the blockade reduced the Gazan economy significantly, though. I mean, the report, I think, is like that's a demonstrable, I think.
It's actually not anecdotal, but again, it's one that it actually shows on the eve of October 7th, the Human Development Index of Gaza is better than about 90 countries. The notion, and this again goes to the beginning of our conversation, the fact that there is economic success or more money or less money, more settlements, less settlements, all of these things have exactly zero impact on the Palestinian ideology of no Jewish state. The Palestinians could have made a choice. The blockade begins 2 years after Israel fully withdraws from Gaza. Gaza actually started shelling Israel already from 2001. The fact that Israel got out, they continued shelling Israel. It's only in 2007. And yet people, one of the things that often people do is reversal of cause and effect. The people of Gaza had a choice. They could have taken, finally, the first time that they control territory, that the Arabs of the Levant finally control territory, and to say we're going to turn Gaza into the pearl of the Mediterranean. I was working with Shimon Peres at the time. He did everything to make that possible. He raised his money, individual people, to give all the agricultural places so that the Palestinians can continue to export agriculture from the Gaza Strip. And the first thing they did is to destroy all of that. So there is actually, at one point, you need to respect them and take them at their word. But I will add to that I completely agree with Stephen. There's a wonderful piece recently written by my colleague, Dr. Shani Moore, on the 4 failed concepts that led to October 7th. And the fourth one, the third and the fourth, talk about the completely destructive role of the international community that has basically constantly, like Stephen said, allow the Palestinians to continue to believe that they can imagine a Palestine from the river to the sea. I was recently in a terrible conference that was under the message of to heal. And it was all this like blah, blah healing stuff with Israelis and Palestinians. And at one point I said, look, in order to heal, the part of the wound has to be over, right? You do not begin the healing when people are still shooting. You need to know that the shooting is over, and then you begin to take care of the wound. The biggest tragedy in this conflict is that again and again, I think this has to do with the role of the Jews in the Western imagination, again and again, the Palestinians have been saved, but not really saved, indulged in not embracing defeat. I'm using the title of a book about Japan post-World War II. People sometimes cringe from hearing it, but actually, if you want to move forward every time in history, you often have to accept that you were defeated. The Arabs have to accept that insofar as their goal has been to prevent a Jewish state in any part of the land, in that aspect, they were defeated. They should put a line on it. They should embrace that defeat and begin to develop a vision of living next to a Jewish state rather than instead of it. The day they do that, I can assure you, they will be sovereign. There will be no blockade. There will be trade. There is nothing more than we want than the Arabs around us to finally decide that they want to live next to us rather than instead of us. We'll be happy to just live together and trade and be at peace. That's all we want.
But Stephen, you disagree. You think the blockade should go sooner than that.
I mean, I feel like it should go as a show of good faith. I do agree that there is a negative ethos, a very heavy ideology that kind of powers the people there in terms of like wanting to fight and resist forever. But I mean, like you've got like a new generation of people. It was said that Arabs would never make peace with Jews, but it's happened with the surrounding Arab states. Now there's a different situation with the Palestinians, obviously, because there's contested land, but I think it's possible. But people need to be shown that there's like another way to live. People have to be shown that there can be something different besides the constant fighting. And, one thing that I discovered for myself.
But they were shown that.
What?
I mean, I have to ask, at one point, how many times, that's the thing that drives me crazy, how many times do you have to show good faith again and again? We negotiated. We got out of the Gaza Strip. How many times do we need to show good faith until it is understood that for the conflict to end, the ideology that wants nothing less than no Jewish state anywhere between the river and the sea, that ideology has to die? And as soon as that ideology dies, there will be no blockades, no occupations. There will be none of that.
Okay, this is the description I'll give. So description, not prescription. So I'm not making a moral judgment. But what I will say is that Israel enjoys broad support from the West and from the United States especially, because the vision that people have in Generation X and above, people in their 40s and older, is Israel was the single democracy in the Middle East in a sea of enemies that managed to exist, survive, and then eventually thrive as an ally to the United States. And that's like the impression, I think, that is in a lot of people's minds. For my generation and younger, when you think Israel, you think, oh, those are the people that terrorize Palestinians. That's the only impression that people have in their mind. Because no one else is attacking them except for Iranian proxies who are whatever. And then you've just got the Palestinians. If that situation persists, I think that it will see a marked decrease for Israeli support from the West. And I think that Israel will find itself backed into a corner that it won't be able to get out from, because once you've lost that support, and then once you, God forbid, if you were to start losing the support of surrounding Arab states, the situation would become dire. So I agree that it sucks, and it's definitely not a fair situation in a variety of ways, of course. But I mean, like Olmert said this to me like 30 times, right? You don't make peace with friends, you make peace with enemies. There has to be some path, and Israel has to be like a trailblazer here. Like it has to be, not like, well, we'll accept peace if you guys want to come to us and actually make an agreement. And until then, we're going to be happy to kind of like do as we are, because I think that path that Israel is on is not a good path. I think that it would be very bad. I'm not arguing that it's fair or anything else. I'm just saying that I think that something has to be resolved there. And it probably is going to require like aggressive measures from the Israeli side, through diplomacy, through peace, through, a combination of things, military included, in order to make that work. Or if not, I got a lot of trouble for saying this a year ago, blow them all up, either move them all out or make peace with them. But this like in between land is just, it's keeping a wound open forever. It's like a necrotic flesh wound where you can find a way to cure it and make it good, or you can amputate, but you can't leave it there, because all it's going to do is rot and grow and eventually lead to your death, which I think is what's happening right now. So there has to be something has to happen. Yeah.
So, I think he's saying, and then we can wrap up, is that even though Israel has done goodwill in the past, they still have to remove the blockade to give the Palestinians a feeling that they can have a good life. And the blockade diminishes that. I know you gave the story about how their economy is better than 90 countries, but there's demonstrable evidence that it does weaken their economy. I don't know by what exact number. I mean, do you think it doesn't hurt their livelihood, the blockade? Or
I think the blockade is incredible, is a subset of the fact that their priority for the last century has been to not have a Jewish state. I'm saying if their choice would have been or would be at any point to prioritize having a state next to the Jewish state, there would not be a need for anything, because there would be peace. So the quite inefficient blockade was merely the result of the fact that despite Israel showing goodwill, trying, by the way, to cut the flesh wound, to completely get out of Gaza, to show goodwill, to allow them to control territory without agreement and just have them run with it, what have they done? They have turned it into a weaponized, integrated area for the purpose of liberating Palestine from the river to the sea and their wording of no Jewish state. So every time you focus on blockade, settlements, all of these, I always go back to the foundational issue. It's the ideology. and the ideology has to die. They have to embrace the defeat of the ideology, like the defeat of Nazism, the defeat of Japanese imperialism. Some ideologies need to be defeated. And if I may, Olmert is wrong that you make peace with enemies. You make peace with defeated enemies. You make peace with enemies who have embraced defeat, that have accepted that the war is over, and then you begin the negotiations of peace. That has always been the basis for enduring peace. That's how we get to something. And I agree with you, Stephen and Jake. I want something to happen. This is why I keep on focusing again and again on the core issue, the ideology. And the ideology has to die. And I completely agree that the international community has played a completely destructive role that has repeatedly disincentivized ending this conflict.
Final thoughts, Stephen?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I necessarily disagree. I guess the only thing that is kind of depressing is that when I talk to Palestinians, I can get a lot of agreement on the side that Israelis need to do a lot more work, and the Palestinians, have obviously suffered a great deal over the past 80 years for a variety of reasons. But anytime I suggest, well, maybe the Palestinians should do a little bit, it's like I'm met with the harshest pushback, like, no, fuck that, we're not going to do anything. And then sometimes I feel like when I speak on the Israeli side, it feels kind of similar, where it's like, well, the Palestinians obviously have messed up a lot historically, but when it's time for, should Israel do anything? Well, no, fuck that, we've tried, fuck them. And it's like, okay, well, it feels like as long as both sides have those like narratives kind of like stuck in their head, not to say there's I'm drawing a false equivalency a bit between the crimes of both sides, but yeah, I guess it just feels intractable when the thoughts are like that, I guess, on both ends. Yeah.
Is it intractable, Einat? And your final thoughts?
It's not. I draw hope from history, from the fact that a lot of bad ideologies have ultimately been defeated in history, replaced by different ideologies. We have to admit that sometimes wars have been important. Wars, defeat, have been important in order for people to understand that ideologies have been wrong. So I draw inspiration from the fact that people change, nations change. I believe that the Arabs and the Muslim world can embrace the existence of a Jewish state, not just reluctantly, but actually as part of a full and proud Arab and Muslim identity. And ultimately, I think that it's a tragedy that the Palestine Arabs have been ultimately indulged for so long in the ability to avoid accepting and embracing the fact that the goal of from the river to the sea is not going to happen. They can live next to a Jewish state rather than instead of it. The day that we will have a plurality, I'm not just even saying the majority, the day that we have a plurality of Palestinians that accept it, I can assure you, is the day that we will be able to negotiate peace.
And with that, thank you both so much for your time. I'm going to end the recording and let's just spend 30 seconds wrapping up.